and extraordinary terms is Mike Benz. This is an interview that's going to change the way you understand reality, media, and the deep state in particular. For the first 15 minutes or so, we will be on YouTube, but then you're going to have to watch us exclusively on Rumble, but precisely because Mike Benz is dismantling the state before your very eyes. Let me know, to win a mug, what is the phrase he used to describe the nexus of interest that control the world? Is it the slab? Is it the git? Or is it C, the blob? You can win a mug if you answer that correctly. Let us know in both the Rumble chat and, of course, the Awakened Wonder chat over on locals who've already seen this live and had the ability to ask questions to Mike. For example, Judy Denmark asked a beautiful, valuable, and important question. And you will get 25% off these mugs when you add them to the basket at the moment. The reason we're giving away these mugs, more or less, is because that's what the deep state thinks we are. So, let's get into Mike Benz. Mike Benz is a former State Department official with responsibilities in formulating and negotiating U.S. foreign policy on international communications and information technology matters. He founded FFO as a civil society institution, building on his experience in the role of championing digital freedom around the world in the public sector. You can follow him on X at Mike Benz Cyber. There's a link in the chat right now for that. And visit foundationforfreedomonline.com. There's a link for that as well. It's an incredible conversation. We talked about the rigged state, rigged elections, the deep state, the CIA in Ukraine. You're going to come out of this so smart. Just let me know what your favorite bit of this is and get ready to get educated. Okay, without further hullabaloo, here's my conversation with Mike Benz. Will only be available on YouTube for a minute because this is just too intoxicating. Check it out. Mike, thank you.
Thanks, Russell, for having me.
Mike, your interview with Tucker Carlson has, I think, moved the needle when it comes to understanding the deep state, when it comes to understanding censorship, continuing the important work of Martin Gurry, the former CIA analyst and author of the book Revolt of the Public, and helps us to understand that we're living in a moment where global authority is recognizing that their monoculture is under threat and that there is a kind of natural inertia towards more decentralized power, more communication, more free speech, and this surge towards authoritarianism, even if it's under the auspices of liberal ideas, is a response to the possibility of true freedom. Does that, broadly speaking, fit your analysis of what's happening on a macro level, Mike?
Yeah, that's completely it. And you know, to pierce through that with a little bit more specificity, you have basically this foreign policy establishment is what it's typically referred to in Washington. These are the elements of our national governments, both in the US and in the UK and in NATO countries, that are supposed to be foreign facing to manage, you know, the empire, so to speak, but are supposed to be for the benefit of the citizens who live in that country. And what they've basically discovered is because of free speech on the internet, they've lost control over the bumper rails around democracy when media was typically controlled or intermediated by the state. And so now you basically have the foreign policy establishment against domestic populism, which is not a partisan issue. You know, left-wing populism and right-wing populism, you know, both flank this kind of globalist or neoliberal sort of structure that we're describing. And so it's really not a partisan issue. It's not a Republican Democrat thing. It's kind of a universal human experience now trying to fight against this blob.
I like that you've coined that phrase, the blob. And in many of my conversations lately, I've been quoting what you said about democracy, that democracy does not now mean electoral process and representation of the will of the people. It means the protection of a set of institutions. I wonder if you would elaborate on that idea as it pertains to, for example, the protection of democracy in Ukraine and the obligation of the American or British taxpayer to not advocate for a diplomatic end to the war in order to protect Ukrainian people, but an ongoing, potentially unwinnable, potentially eventually nuclear war with an indefatigable and difficult to defeat opponent. How does the use of the term democracy apply here?
Well, that's a perfect example. I just want to start with one quick clarification. I wish that I had coined the term the blob to describe the foreign policy establishment. Unfortunately, that distinction goes to President Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who used that term to describe the blob, and the blob loved the term so much that they now use that term lovingly to describe themselves. So right now on my X handle, I have a quote from Victoria Nuland's husband, since we're about to talk about Ukraine and a lot of the funny business going on over there. Victoria Nuland's husband is Robert Kagan. 1 week before the 2020 election, he wrote in Brookings a piece called "Respect the Blob." This was his advice for the next president of the United States 1 week before the 2020 election. He wrote, "Respect the blob, learn from the blob, love the blob." Wow. So this is one of the arch blob monsters whose wife is basically running the show of foreign policy in the hotbed of Ukraine, who's basically saying, if you want to have stability in your next presidency, you will love us and do what we say. In fact, you will learn from us. We are your master, not the other way around, which is really, I think, quite a profound insight that you can publish that publicly, and few will even bat an eye. But on the Ukraine situation, Ukraine has not had elections in 3 years. They banned elections a year and a half ago. They banned it again 6 months ago. It really is the archetypal example of democracy's redefinition from being a consensus of individuals to a consensus of institutions. We say that we are, in Ukraine to defend democracy. Meanwhile, there is no democratic vote. What we have there are, basically a set of what we call democratic institutions, which is a very, very nasty framing device intended to deceive people about what's really going on. See, we flood the zone with NGOs and civil society institutions, so-called civil society institutions, as well as getting hundreds of thousands of people on payroll in order to co-opt portions of the region that we are trying to politically control. So Victoria Nuland herself, I just read the quote from her husband, respect the blob, learn from the blob, love the blob. Victoria Nuland, when she was the head of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, ahead of the 2014 coup that was jointly orchestrated by the U.S. and U.K. governments, Victoria Nuland was on a panel where she publicly discussed how they pumped, the State Department pumped $5 billion into Ukrainian civil society in the run-up to that coup. So that is, they capacity built a regime change instrument with $5 billion in taxpayer money. And that gets distributed to a network of NGOs. So, for example, there's an entity called the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Now, I talked about this just last night on Dan Bongino's show. We had the biggest stream on the internet going through this, where we discussed the so-called Red Lines memo. This was a memo by the democratic institutions of Ukraine. It was 60 or 70 undersigned civil society institutions who all got funding either directly from the U.S. State Department, USAID, or CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, or through the George Soros networks, who's partnered with the State Department and NATO, where 1 week into Zelensky's election in 2019, they described all of the red lines that if he passed them in terms of policy in Ukraine, it would cause so-called political instability, meaning that they would overthrow his government. He would become as unstable as his predecessors were. And it was on security issues, financial issues, cultural issues, national identity issues. If they wanted to change the language laws and allow Russian as a speaking language back in the state, that these 70 plus State Department and UK Foreign Office funded NGO swarms would destabilize the country. But that's what they mean by democracy. They mean a consensus of those institutions, not the people who live in Ukraine.
Okay, before the next question, we're going to have to leave YouTube, so Mike will be paused for a moment. Remember, you can become an awakened wonder and you'll get access to some astonishing deals. And if you can answer the question I posed correctly in the Rumble stream or in the local stream, you can win one of these entirely for free. They're 25% off at the moment, as you can see. Anyway, and if you're answering the question on Rumble, remember to send us your email details so we can organize the delivery of your prize. Anyway, people, awakened wonders on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. Click the link in your description. Get over to Rumble to watch this important conversation right now. See you in a second.